Never shall I forget that night, the first night in camp that turned my life into one long night, 7 times sealed. Never shall I forget that smoke. Never shall I forget the small faces of the children whose bodies I saw transformed into smoke under a silent sky. Never shall I forget those flames that consumed my faith forever.
In his memoir, Night, author and Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel described his experiences at the hands of Nazi Germany from his hometown in Romania to the concentration camps of Auschwitz and Buchenwald to his liberation by Allied soldiers. This harrowing story chronicles the terror inflicted on those groups the Nazis deemed unfit. Today, we're going to examine how the start of World War II began the next stage of the Holocaust. We'll also examine why so many people were willing to take part in the atrocities or turn a blind eye to them. In September of 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, plunging Europe into World War II. By 1942, the Nazis controlled huge areas of Europe, stretching from France to parts of the Soviet Union. For Jews and other groups the Nazis deemed unfit, years of nightmares turned into reality. How would the Nazi conquest of Europe impact these groups? Once World War II began, members of the German armed forces began conquering territory across Europe. As they took control, they implemented laws and policies similar to those implemented in Germany. And, just like in Germany, the Nazis systematically isolated targeted groups before resorting to violence. Nazi officials stripped Jews and other targeted groups of their civil rights and legal protections, rounded them up, and forced them to live in ghettos. A ghetto refers to an area of a city where Jewish people were forced to live, isolated from the rest of the community. These areas were often walled or surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by armed German troops. Why would the Nazis want to isolate Jewish individuals in ghettos? Forcibly relocating Jewish populations into ghettos was designed to separate them from the rest of society. This isolation would make it easier to target the Jewish population. And as the war raged in places like Poland, Russia, and Ukraine, the Nazis employed a wing of their paramilitary known as Death's Head Squads to systematically kill individuals they deemed unfit. These troops terrorized communities throughout Eastern Europe. And while the beginning of World War II allowed the Nazis to isolate Jewish communities in ghettos and commit genocide using Death's Head Squads, they began to look for more systematic and industrialized ways to commit genocide. With such a large territory under their control, the Nazis had to coordinate between different parts of the government to enact their murderous program. On January 20th, 1942, government officials and military leaders met at an estate in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee. This set into motion what became known as the final solution to the Jewish question, the murder of millions of innocent civilians on an industrial scale. But what do we mean by murder on an industrial scale? The Nazis used developments in science, technology, and transportation to create a system that was ruthlessly efficient in its ability to kill millions of people. With Jewish populations isolated in ghettos, the Nazis would then use the network of railways crisscrossing occupied territories to transport entire communities to concentration camps. Concentration camps are facilities where large groups of people, especially political prisoners and targeted groups, are housed in horrifically inadequate or oppressive conditions. Once victims arrived at concentration camps, the Nazis organized them into two different groups. Individuals believed to be incapable of work were sent to death camps. In these death camps, prison guards stripped people of any possessions they owned and sent prisoners to their deaths in gas chambers. If the Nazis deemed someone to be fit, healthy, and capable of work, they sent them to forced labor camps. In these camps, the Nazis forced prisoners to produce materials deemed necessary to wage war. The Nazis subjected prisoners to sadistic guards, chronic malnutrition, and cramped living conditions that bred disease. Once individuals were too weak or sick to work, the Nazis transferred them to death camps or left them to die where they were. And because the Nazis were transporting entire communities to the camps, families would be sorted into different camps upon arrival. What would this process do to families sent to concentration camps? The Nazis often forcibly separated families from one another. Children separated from parents. Husbands taken away from wives. It became almost impossible to keep track of loved ones, and many families were forever broken. But murder on an industrial scale required the participation of thousands of different individuals in hundreds of different places. Some of these individuals were true believers in the violent anti-Semitism of the Nazis. They saw Adolf Hitler as a leader who represented how they felt and didn't need to be persuaded to take part in atrocities. However, they only made up a portion of the German people. Others have been radicalized by Nazi propaganda. Constant exposure to anti-Semitic images, speeches, and news articles made it easier to feel hatred toward the targeted groups. Had circumstances been different, these folks may still have had anti-Semitic views, but may not have committed acts of violence. Local political leaders helped identify and round up members of targeted groups. There were soldiers and members of the police who helped guard ghettos and concentration camps. After the war, many of these people argued that they were just acting on orders from Nazi leaders. But what is the problem with following orders that lead to genocide? Following orders that result in mass murder completely ignores a person's moral responsibility to other human beings. People living in occupied areas also collaborated with the Nazis. They may have identified neighbors who were members of targeted groups. But what was their motivation for helping the people who invaded their country? Some were motivated by prejudice and hatred. Others were motivated by economic gain. They hoped to take over businesses owned by Jewish community members. Or they wanted to move into housing owned by people the Nazis targeted. And the occupying Nazis were also willing to threaten physical violence against local residents who didn't help identify neighbors. Collaboration was often a form of self-preservation. Other people simply chose to ignore the events of the Holocaust. They paid no attention to neighbors disappearing. They remained ignorant of the concentration camps operating throughout the region. One of the keys to understanding the true nature of the Holocaust is understanding the different ways that people participated in and enabled the Nazis' genocidal program. There were enthusiastic participants, individuals who had their prejudices activated, people who saw it as an opportunity, officials who were just following orders, and others who just wanted to ignore the evil.
Never shall I forget that night, the first night in camp that turned my life into one long night, 7 times sealed.
For communities targeted by the Nazis, the start of World War II was the beginning of a years-long nightmare. As the Nazis conquered huge areas of Europe, they began implementing their racist policies. Jewish communities were forced into ghettos. Death's head squads murdered innocent civilians throughout Eastern Europe. But after the Wannsee Conference in 1942, events escalated into large-scale industrial murder. And this required the collaboration of ordinary citizens throughout Nazi-occupied Europe. In our next lesson, we'll examine the different ways that targeted communities resisted the Holocaust and what happened after the fall of the Nazi regime. Until then, remember that history is everywhere.